right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the MORPC team for our fourth session in our Regional Housing Strategy Series. I'm Thea Ewing. I'm the Transportation and Infrastructure Development Director here at the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. And last year here at MORPC, we shared with our region the Regional Housing Strategy. It builds upon previous studies to provide a comprehensive view of today's housing market in Central Ohio. It identifies 5 core housing issues being experienced across Central Ohio. It recommends investment priorities for the region's public and not-for-profit housing resources, regulatory strategies, and opportunities for new programs to address core housing issues and achieve the greatest impact on housing supply and affordability in our region. It also established regional metrics to monitor the performance of the housing market in meeting our needs of our residents as we move forward in building a great region for all of you. So today we are hosting a discussion with planning leaders on the concept of the 15-minute city. This session is focused on striving for the benefits of convenience and accessibility for regional citizens from their respective neighborhoods. So you may ask yourself, what is a 15-minute city? Envision a community where residents can meet most of their daily needs, including getting to school, shopping, the library, parks, and doctor's appointments, all within 15 minutes walk, bike ride from their home. And they also have access to great transit and crucial regional connections beyond that. To be fair, this is not a new concept. Actually, across the world and in many older American cities, there are several 15-minute cities. They do possess things like prolific public transit options, safe and well-identified bike and pedestrian corridors, well-planned neighborhoods, parks, schools, and commercial centers. And personally, I just like to share, I feel like I grew up in one of these cities. I grew up in a neighborhood in Hamilton, Ohio, just outside of the Cincinnati area, where I was fortunate to have a 15-minute access to everywhere I needed to go, even before I was able to drive a car. I walked to my elementary school, my junior high, and my high school. I could ride my bike to the store and pick up things for my mom at the same commercial center she would drive our car to pick up items. And I could even walk to my doctor's office or the hospital when it was needed, all within under 15 minutes from my home. And can we return to this? Do we have neighborhoods that can do this here in Central Ohio today? And how can we strengthen our sense of community and provide better opportunities for all of our residents through creating these 15-minute neighborhoods and cities? What do we need to do to get there? So I think we do have a really excellent panel of seasoned planners ready to tackle this concept with you today. So first, we have Austin Gibble. He's an administrator of long-range transportation planning, and he's coming to us from the city of Indianapolis. Jordan Henderson, he's the director of housing and community development for all people here in Central Ohio. Harvey Miller, PhD and director of the Center for Urban and Regional Analysis at The Ohio State University. And Kevin Wheeler, he's the assistant director of growth policy for the city of Columbus. Moderating this great group of planners is Kimberly Sharp, senior director of development with the Central Ohio Transit Authority. So Kim, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Thea, and thank you to our guests for attending today, and thank you for our panel. We really appreciate you being here. I'm going to take just a few minutes and introduce a concept. Last year at this time, Dr. Kirsten Carr with MORPC and I together were part of the Columbus CEO's Future 50 class. And we were asked to present an article for the Columbus CEO magazine, an upshot idea. There were lots of wonderful ideas from our classmates. I do have to admit, the idea that Dr. Carr and I wrote on was about the 15-minute city, just to imagine what it could mean. And my very brief presentation is highlighting some of those items. So give me 1 second. This is our only presentation today. I have this all queued up and ready. Okay, I'll do my screen. Thank you for giving me 1 second here. So the 15-minute city, speaking of today, Here we go. I knew I would get it. Basically, just as Thea pointed out, it's really about people-centered development, how people can get to work. The photo here is one of our local schools, and a lot of our schools do this. They have a walk and bike day where people can give it a shot and see what it's like. And I think it's pretty exciting that from that, they hope that folks may actually see how easy it is to walk and bike and do it more often. But really, it's how we design our streets and how we safe people feel getting from home to school. And that's what we call people-centered development. Is it developed so it's an easy choice for people to make? Part of a 15-minute city is providing equal access to core services, ensuring, and we'll talk about that more later on, that basic needs can be met by biking and walking as a choice. You can also still drive there, but things are more central. Activities that make urban life enjoyable. And when we say urban life, it's where development is happening, which is all over and at all different scales. And we'll talk about scalability here shortly. Community scale, education, healthcare, essential retail, parks and working spaces, vibrant neighborhoods, which people really flock to and need for their well-being. Connecting 15-minute neighborhoods together in our city is a goal, and transportation is key to that connectivity. This is just pointing out that Milan has been doing some experimentation with this for a while, and they are learning that the polycentric idea of urban development, where they have a node, and then how it's connected, has really contributed to this work from home space, because not everyone's working from their home, but the pandemic has taught a lot of cities a lot of things about how we handle our neighborhood, that proximity has become the norm for millions of people. So what is the space around where we live, and how is that associated to work? That's some good articles I wanted to point out. The next item is a short video from Paris. And all that's in the background is music. So I'm going to just narrate this slightly. We are not trying to be Paris, and that's not the intent here. The intent is this has some very simple and clean ideas about why Paris is focusing on a 15-minute city for their future development, and some items they're really trying to work on. And I just like how they express it. Sorry, I think I stopped it too early. I apologize for that. So maybe it's the end. Just wrapping this up, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Locally, this is just an example. We know that we have 15-minute neighborhoods in the Central region, very much loved, to where you can work and live, shop, and get amenities, and people really flock to the neighborhoods. But we know that Central is also a very car-centric neighborhood, car-centric design. And so what do we learn from each other? I'm just pointing out this article from Denver. I appreciated the focus of was the GPD and what it does to your economic development patterns. And the thought of building a walkable city was really key to economic success. It's part of their economic development tools is designing these nodes, and it's for very strong reasons. I'm not going to go into the details, but please feel free to look up this article. that there is success to learn from how they attract and develop these nodes as a community, as a development pattern. This is my fun slide on what are elements of a 15-minute neighborhood. I grew up with Richard Scarry. And really, Busy-Town taught us a long time ago what is part of a 15-minute neighborhood. Lots of stuff going on. And people are very busy. And there's work and they're baking bread. And there's just lots of stuff going on, which makes it a lot of fun. And not everyone lives in Busy-Town, but it's definitely a good concept at a very easy to understand level of a 15-minute neighborhood. And then, of course, we have more academic articles, which have very specific elements that lead to a success of what you can get around you in a short commute by biking or walking. And it's really that marriage of transportation choices and the mix of uses at different scales that make it appropriate for each neighborhood. So with that, I just want to touch on some thoughts of connecting 15-minute neighborhoods together. Because Central Ohio is a large community. There's multiple cities, multiple jurisdictions. And there's a really good example outside of Washington, D.C. here in the Arlington area. The Washington area Metro Transit has been working with the municipalities for many years. The planning for this line actually started in the 60s and the 70s. And this line heads out from the DC area out into the suburbs. And all of this was suburban development in the 60s and 70s. But the stops themselves became central to developing 15-minute neighborhoods around each one with their own characteristics. The Rosslyn stop is the first big one outside of DC, and it's its own, metro area. The courthouse area has a lot of civic uses. The Clarendon area is more of an urban village. Virginia Square, a lot of academia, and Ballston is more of a city within another central city has formed over the years. Now, each of these have their own scale, their own personalities, their own specific attractions for jobs, as well as housing choices and retail choices. But they were centralized around those transportation choices. And in this case, it was transit, as well as incentives for that type of development, lower parking, et cetera. Those are things that are married together. So here's where I want to bring up something that I'm heavily involved in, as well as Kevin Wheeler here on the panel with us. Link Us, moving our region together. This is a plug. Please take a look at linkuscolumbus.com. And the goal is to understand how to marry the transit planning, multiple transportation choice planning, mobility planning with central nodes. They could be 15-minute neighborhoods. That would be something to really incorporate and think about in a way that connects them. And what happens at each of these transit stops, and how are they interconnected, of course, with bikes and peds and a mix of uses that's healthy to entertain. This is a visual provided by our colleagues at the City of Columbus looking up Olentangy River Road. A typical Central Ohio community. This is a major thoroughfare, of course, and very car-centric design. But the thought is overlaying these goals of mobility options, very walkable when you arrive, high-quality stations, quality development that's easily accessible, multimodal hubs, enhanced pedestrian safety measures, and then everything is easily accessible. So I'm going to switch to a couple of current examples of housing choices along corridors. Things to think about. There is a lot of development on West Broad Street, and you can see there's different housing choices being developed, but it makes it easy for the folks living in those housing choices to choose transit or walking or biking because it's easily accessible. And then another good example of some holistic planning along Cleveland Avenue, Homeport is bringing forward Mulby Place, which is more affordable senior living and some other options, thinking about Linden as a 15-minute neighborhood and what's happening in Linden and options and opportunities for the community, including housing choices. These are just some current examples happening along our corridors. And just to recap, the focus of a 15-minute city is that it is walkable. There's equitable access to things that people need every day. Public space is important. Mix of uses, mix of housing choices, scaled appropriately for that neighborhood, transit and land use planning. I call it a marriage, and more sustainable growth patterns. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we would like to move into our panel. I would like to take a few minutes, and we're going to have each of our panel members introduce themselves. And our icebreaker question for you is, please introduce yourself and tell us about your best memory of being in a 15-minute city or neighborhood. And with that, I'm going to toss the baton to Mr. Kevin Wheeler from the City of Columbus.
Thank you, Kim. So again, Kevin Wheeler, and I'm Assistant Director for Growth Policy with the City of Columbus. And I will just say that for those of you who are curious as to what that means, Columbus is going through really a transition in terms of how we're growing and how we're changing. Historically, we've grown through territorial expansion as well as population growth. But as an example, just this last census, which we of course found out about the results of last week, we grew by 15%, but territorially we only grew by 1.2%. So we're growing up more than out. And that brings with it all kinds of questions. And a lot of those kind of come back to this topic that we're going to talk about today. My experience with a 15-minute city is a lot like Thea's. I lived initially in Bucyrus, Ohio, a small county seat. So you can imagine a second grader on a bicycle. I could go to the toy store, the bakery, I could walk to school. I had all kinds of freedom and explored the city, loved it. And then, now fast forward, I have a son who lives in New York City, and that's not only a 15-minute city, it's a 24-hour 15-minute city. So I love those kinds of environments and just really value what that can mean in terms of quality of life. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm going to pass it now to Austin. Austin, visiting us from Indianapolis.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Austin Gibble. I am the Administrator of Long-Range Transportation Planning with the City of Indianapolis. My favorite 15-minute city memory probably has to be in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And that was the first time I had experienced a 15-minute city that wasn't necessarily a large coastal city or a European city. There's a lot of big examples and overseas examples, but that was the first time that I had experienced something that says this built environment is somewhat familiar. The density is somewhat familiar, but the connectivity is so much stronger. And that really resonated with me. And I had a lovely time in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And if you've never been, I highly recommend it, especially for 15-minute, 20-minute city purposes.
Thank you. Mr. Jordan Henderson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Henderson. I am the Director of Housing with Community Development for All People. We are a community development corporation focused predominantly on the South Side, and my role is focused on preservation and increasing the stock of housing that is affordable to people of a variety of incomes. I'd say that my favorite 15-minute city is more of a 15-minute neighborhood in Chicago, the Edgewater neighborhood. I lived there for a time, and it's a wonderful community proximate to the lake with all kinds of amenities that are in very easy walking distance, anything from great Thai food to the dry cleaners to multiple grocery stores, recreation amenities, ice cream parlors, things of that nature. And so during my time there, I kind of became resentful when I had to leave my neighborhood because there were so many things available to me within the neighborhood. So I'd say that that's my favorite example.
Thank you. And Dr. Miller.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harvey Miller. I'm a professor of geography and director of the Center for Urban Regional Analysis at Ohio State. And we do work in data-driven urban science for sustainability across campus and in the community. And, in my career, I've had opportunities during sabbaticals to actually spend time in 15-minute cities around the world. For example, I've been visiting faculty at University of Munster in Germany, in Ghent, Belgium, in Zurich, and also in Melbourne. And it really is a quite an experience to be plopped into a city and realize you don't have to rely upon a car at all. In fact, when I was at University of Munster, they gave me a bicycle along with my guest housing. They said, "This is our guest bicycle." And I said, "Really?" And they said, "That's all you need, Munster, is a bicycle and shoes to get everything you need." And they were correct. But I think the best memory I have actually was decades ago when, after growing up in the suburbs of Cleveland, I entered school at Kent State University. And for the first time in my life, I was able to get around without a car and have everything within easy walking distance. And that one really made a big impression on me. That affected really my whole way of thinking and really my whole career now. There's a meme on social media that says that most people miss their college days because it's the only time in their life they lived in a walkable community. And I think that's true. And I think if you want to make this real, think about what a good time and how easy college was. And you can have a little bit of that now in the future in your own neighborhood.
That's a good point. I did grow up on a farm in Ohio. And when in 8th grade, I was able to take a trip to New York City, which of course blew my mind as a farm girl. But I did go to Ohio State and in the 90s and jumped on and off CODA and rode my bike to my apartment and became quite independent. And that was just a learning experience. I'll share that I've traveled all over. I've experienced transit in wonderful neighborhoods all over the world. I do want to share that I do live in Westerville, Ohio, and it feels like a 15-minute bubble for sure. I can get anything I need and it's very walkable. But with that, we're going to go into a panel discussion. We have lots of great questions. We want to hear your thoughts. For the guests listening in, you can enter comments on the YouTube comments and on the MORPC website. And I believe the link is in the YouTube comments as we speak. And we're monitoring that. So we're happy to take your questions as we can. Those will be sent to me by our MORPC staff. So thank you for that. So let's get started. I'll call on you if you guys don't speak up, but I have a feeling this is a great group who's definitely going to speak up. When you're out and about and you arrive someplace, how do you know that you have arrived into a 15-minute city or a 15-minute neighborhood?
Well, for me, I think if it's a foreign place that I'm visiting for the first time, one of the best indicators is perhaps a really obvious one, just people walking in measurable numbers. If I see people walking around and perhaps carrying shopping bags or going in and out of various establishments, that's a really strong indicator to me as an outsider that it's a walkable community or walkable city. 15-minute city, I'm sorry.
I guess I'll jump in after Jordan because I agree with what he said. The biggest indication is people on the streets, and not just people on the streets like Thursday, Friday, and Saturday evening, but people on the streets like throughout normal hours, just doing everything, shopping, recreating, meeting members of their neighborhood in third spaces like coffee shops and parks, conducting their daily lives, but out on the street and doing things. And I think when you see that, more or less around the clock and every day of the week, you're there.
I echo those sentiments, and something I typically look for in addition to pedestrian activity, biking activity, is also an identifiable anchor. What do things orbit around? Is there a central rail station? Is there a BRT station? Is there something that's clearly drawing people in and out and creating this center of activity around accessibility?
And I think in agreement with all those comments, and would maybe add just that a lot of times the streetscape itself, the way buildings relate to the street and the environment, the mix of uses, and it can be small scale, human scale, it can be relatively large scale, but there is just a connection between that built environment and the streetscape and the sidewalk and so on.
So Kevin, if you want to keep going, my next question actually moves into the role of transit, or I'm going to say transportation choices within a 15-minute neighborhood or 15-minute city. How would you relate those together?
So it's interesting. We did a survey that we're going to be releasing here in the next month or so of folks asking them to, among other things, share with us some of the priorities that they had for the city's updated the zoning code. And, we're in early stages. We're kind of assessing the code, but we have a code that hasn't been updated comprehensively in a long time. And two of the most common priorities, two of the overall priorities and two priorities that showed up just regardless of, the demographic subsection were walkability. That was number one overall. And transit was always either number two or number three. And I think, transit is particularly important just in terms of providing folks who don't have a car, don't want to have a car, with access. And in a city like Columbus, that's so large, Central Ohio, that has so much of our community, and this is the same thing I know Austin and Indianapolis, so much of our community is not mixed use in the way that we'd like it to be. Transit is one of those things that is just so critical in providing access and opportunity, not only in the meantime, until we may be able to introduce more mixed use, but it enhances access in instances where maybe we've already got that. So I think the connection is really strong between development and transit. It's just totally interrelated.
And then, Austin, I'm going to tap you for your experience in both Indianapolis with the Indigo lines that have been evolving. We've actually went over and experienced them. It was awesome. And your time in Minneapolis. Can you talk about the integration of transit planning and land use planning and that idea of a 15-minute neighborhood?
Absolutely. And not just Minneapolis, but we've been making very large strides in the integration of land use planning and transit planning here in Indy. For those who don't know, Indianapolis passed a transit plan known as the Marion County Transit Plan back in 2016, which was a dedicated income tax to go towards our transit provider, and which will build out a frequent grid of local buses as well as 3 bus rapid transit lines. The first of those lines is open and operational, has been for about 2 years. And the next line, the purple line, will start construction next year, and then the blue line will come after that. For many decades, Indianapolis has focused pretty heavily on competing with our neighboring suburbs. And through Unigov, which was the merger of our city-county government, gave a lot of our suburban townships disproportionate power over the city. So a lot of our development over the past 50 years has been heavily suburban, very parking heavy, driving dependent, not very transit accessible. Last week, we passed a transit-oriented development zoning code, which by and large is a wholesale upzoning of most of our residential districts and enabling fourplexes as by right. But also it includes a transit-oriented development overlay within 1,000 feet of both sides of our BRT corridors that really just kind of aligns our zoning codes with what we have with what the development itself is really pushing for within the market. So this makes our mixed use districts much easier to build, but introduces design guidelines to really improve that, including streetscape elements like wider sidewalks, street trees to make the walk between our transit stations and other locations more pleasant. But it also makes things that are not transit conducive more difficult to build. So there's a prohibition on commercial parking lots, gas stations as accessories to grocery stores, car washes, self-storage facilities, things that do not contribute to the idea of the 15-minute neighborhood. The 15-minute neighborhood or the 15-minute city cannot be achieved without having some sort of structure in place to prevent non-contributing uses from forming around these really expensive assets that these cities is investing in.
Fantastic. That was a good example. I appreciate that. I'm going to move on to my next question. I'm going to direct it to Jordan Henderson and Harvey Miller regarding when we're thinking about these 15-minute cities, and how do you feel that these design concepts or thoughts about how to go about this provide more equitable access within 15-minute neighborhoods or cities?
Great question. So here at Community Development for All People, we tend to focus our programming and our vision around the idea of asset-based community development. And so just briefly, we tend to look at deficits in the community as assets more so than liabilities. And so when we observe a problem, it's just a matter of reframing that problem as an asset and working on programming that will attract the solution or fill the gap that we're observing. And so with regard to design, some of the things that we have been able to accomplish here on the South Side is promoting some mixed use development that creates third places. An example of that would be Arts for All People, which is a place for creative expression, art classes that previously didn't exist here on the South Side. In addition to that, some other social ventures that are creating workforce development opportunities within the community and also providing places and amenities for people to walk to or to bike to.
In addressing the equity issue, I think we have to keep in mind about the automobile. We've kind of accepted the automobile as like the normal way of getting around cities now in this time in our lives and history. But cars are very exclusionary because they're expensive. They're a big economic drag on many households. The average household in the United States spends about $9,000 to $10,000 per year on maintaining their automobiles. That's everything in terms of purchase, amortization, maintenance, gasoline. So it is an economic drag to have to rely upon an automobile for many people. Also, there's the ability. I mean, children can't drive, and a lot of older adults can't drive either. So when we think about this, not saying that automobiles are not part of the mobility future, but if we create more mobility options and more mobility choices through 15-minute cities tied together with a good transit system, we have a transit system and a land use system that's more inclusive, that works for more people. And I would also add is more resilient against shocks such as climate change. I mean, we see every day in Columbus our transportation system failing. A simple crash, a rainstorm, and it seizes up. And people are trapped in that because that's their only mobility choice. So by providing this type of 15-minute walkable neighborhoods and city connected by a good transit system, we're giving people, we're creating more inclusive choice for more people, and also as a bonus, a system that is more resilient against shocks which are coming in the future.
Excellent. I know I'm writing down these. I really like the top words of third places, arts for all people, workforce development, inclusive choices for getting around. We do have a couple questions coming in from the audience. So this first one is actually extremely related to what we're just talking about. How can the concept of a 15-minute city prevent gentrification? And more importantly, displacement in urban neighborhoods? Are they mutually exclusive?
I'd like to talk about that. Some of the census data just came in actually is a mixed bag for Columbus, I have to say. We're seeing some good growth patterns, like more people living downtown. We also are seeing displacement and loss of diversity on the east side of town, and a lot of growth on the urban fringe. So that's really it. We have both a good and bad news. And so how do we have infill? How do we have people live in these 15-minute neighborhoods without displacement? I think the real trick is to extend this franchise so that it's in more places. I mean, as long as only certain places like Victorian Village, Old Town East, German Village, Italian Village, places like that are well connected, are walkable and connected to a good public transit system, there's going to be a cost premium for moving into those neighborhoods because that's what people want. If we can extend this franchise to more of the city, people there won't be privileged neighborhoods. It'll be something that's for everybody. So I think the biggest way we can do that is just to make it more widespread in the city, and we won't see this gentrification process happening.
Harvey, before we move on to the next one, when you say franchise, can you explain what you mean?
Oh, I just kind of meant that it's a privilege for some neighborhoods. Maybe franchise is not the right word, but what I mean is that it's a privilege for some neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods are walkable and have access to public transit, and others don't, and that's why some of those neighborhoods are expensive and people get priced out of them. So this whole price differential is because some neighborhoods have it, some neighborhoods don't.
Thank you for explaining that. Does anyone else want to talk about the 15-minute city, how it could prevent gentrification?
Sure. I want to kind of expand on what Harvey mentioned, in that Indianapolis is very similar in that we once had a lot of walkable neighborhoods, a lot of neighborhood nodes, but decades of redlining, systemic racism, systemic disinvestment, urban renewal just wiped out most of those. So what walkable neighborhoods we have left, our most accessible neighborhoods, are the most expensive to live in. And that makes them very exclusionary. So like Harvey mentioned, one is expanding this walkability to other areas and making sure that there is the ability to kind of create these new places, or not new places, but essentially restore what we had, a restorative approach to walkability and accessibility, but also the transit-oriented zoning and is only one piece of the 15-minute city, and creating this an equitable development pattern. I think the next logical step might be transit-oriented communities, and taking a look at broader policy efforts to say, how can we densify this community? How can we introduce new housing typologies without major displacement? And I think some of that might come in the form of density bonuses for permanently affordable housing. But a lot of our resources in terms of preventing displacement are very limited, especially in a place like Indiana, where inclusionary zoning is prohibited by the state of Indiana. So we're having to get very creative on how we can build wealth within these communities for those who already live there, and make sure that those who live there now will continue to enjoy the neighborhoods that they live in as their transit access improves, and as the walkability improves, and as they're able to get to more things within a 15 to 20 minute walk or less.
That was very helpful. Kevin or Jordan, do you guys want to address this idea of displacement in urban neighborhoods as we try to work on having 15-minute neighborhoods?
Sure. I would just say that I wholeheartedly agree with both Harvey and Austin. Great points raised. Here at Community Development for All People, we are a place-based initiative largely. But here on the South Side, we are very intentional about this community remaining inclusive and accessible to people with a variety of income levels and ability levels and identities. And so I would say that taking a very intentional stance and advocacy at the city level or whatever with your municipality to provide assistance in taking that intentional stance, we are aspiring toward what we've called the plateau of stability, which is the goal of controlling 15% of the housing stock in the community, ultimately to make sure that it is accessible to people of a variety of income levels in perpetuity. And so designing programming and working with elected officials to really highlight how neighborhoods are changing and how that is affecting people with the least means, to ensure that that resources are dedicated to development patterns that allow them to stay for the long haul.
Good example of tools. Thank you.
I would just add, I think that those points are really important that Jordan's bringing up. In addition to what Harvey and Austin have already shared, I think, affordability is such a fundamental challenge for us broadly right now. The city recently brought on board someone to focus on affordable housing in sort of a broader way. And we know that this is an issue today without any advancements associated with Linkous. We're seeing this happen. We see this happen throughout our community. And so it's going to require really focused effort to address affordability. And I think, as Harvey started out this conversation, some of these neighborhoods that are the most successful models of a 15-minute city are communities that are particularly attractive. And so you're going to have high pressure in terms of property value in some of these neighborhoods. I would also say that we, though, have other areas of the city, and perhaps Indianapolis is in this place, where we have walkability in the form of gridded streets and transit access, but maybe we haven't seen the economic recovery or the economic investments that other parts of the city have seen. And so there it becomes really even more critical that we're thoughtful about these questions of affordability and change, which will happen.
So that's a good segue to my next topic regarding change. If we want to focus some growth around transit options, mobility options, that usually includes some element of infill, some element of sometimes redevelopment, sometimes element of historic preservation along with appropriate infill. But even cities of old, the extremely walkable ones from 1880 to 1920s, were a lot more dense, a lot more housing units per acre, commercial, completely integrated. As we go back, I like the word restorative approach. I understood that. If we work towards a restorative approach of a walkable neighborhood around these nodes of 15-minute city, they will have more density to them. How do we approach that with our community at large, that conversation of a balance of density and growth with the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood that people really love? Thoughts on that?
If it's all right, I think I'll start that one. And I think part of the answer is within the question itself, right? Is that our cities were a lot more dense. We have infrastructure built to handle densities that are twice what they are now. For example, in Indianapolis, Center Township, which comprises most of our pre-Unigov city, the pre-World War II city, with the exception of some neighborhoods that stick out into other townships, it is still down 50% from where it was in 1960. We have infrastructure that was built to handle twice as many people living in Center Township than exists today. And so when we have this conversation about density, we need to also have a conversation about fiscal responsibility and being able to leverage our existing resources. Continuing to build out and reducing our tax base by building new infrastructure for low density development on the fringes is simply not financially sustainable. Whether or not you have a concern for the environment or pollution or anything, a climate change, anything of that nature, as it relates to infill, that can be a concern or not, but everyone has a concern about living in a city that is financially sustainable and can provide solid public services for its residents. And having a solid density ratio to the infrastructure and services provided is absolutely critical to that.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that point. I recommend a book by Charles Marone, Strong Towns. Some of you probably heard of it. He was a visiting speaker at Kira last spring. And that's one of the arguments he makes is that our horizontal development is basically creating a fiscal time bomb in a lot of cities. I mean, if you think about it, as the radius of a city increases, the area over which you have to provide urban infrastructure and services increases geometrically. It's like the formula for an area of a circle, pi r squared. It's a big increase. So even putting aside the equity and environmental aspects of this, we have to think from a fiscally responsible point of view, which requires more infill development and density. If you took a map of any city in this part of the world, like Columbus, and took the 1910 map of the city and overlaid it with the current map of the city, everything within that 1910 map used to be 2, 3, 4 times as dense. And so we have to kind of get back to that level of density. And I know that's disturbing for some people. They think they don't want 3, 4, or 5-story apartment buildings in their neighborhood. On the other hand, we don't want to go back to early 20th century when a lot of our housing was overcrowded. So we used to live in much more. We want to get density without overcrowding. So we're going to have to accept a more mixed architecture in some of these neighborhoods, unless we want to go back to 6, 7 people living in a 900 square foot house. I don't think a lot of people want to go back to that. So we're going to have that balance so we can continue to live the way we want to, but also live at density.
I think too, for Central Ohio, and I think it's probably the same for Indianapolis and most cities in the Midwest, many of our key corridors, West Broad Street, East Main Street, both of which are currently corridors that Linkus is focusing on as examples, have played really vital roles in these communities, and they continue to. But it's also the case that they've seen disinvestment. We've seen loss of buildings, loss of the built environment, and I think as we look at a growth pattern that will be up more than out, part of that is realizing the opportunity to reinvest in some of these really important corridors so that they become as vital in their communities as they have been in the past. And, I would extend that same perspective beyond these transit corridors, which are so critical, to some of the larger retail centers. And I'm in Columbus, since that's where I'm at, and I think most of the participants are from Columbus. If you think about the Continent, or you think about Bryce-Tusing, and places that I'm not going to make an argument that they're accessible from a transit and walkable perspective today, but these are areas that have capacity for growth in our future in a way that's maybe different than we saw in the first generation.
Very good points. I appreciate that. We have another question that I'm actually going to take a stab at answering a couple of things, and I want you guys to jump in and help out. The next question is, Columbus is the 14th largest city in the U.S. How can small cities and villages in the region best support this idea of a 15-minute city and avoid the traps of sprawl, the shopping center on the edge of town, and develop reliance on the freedom of the automobile? So I will note that there's been a lot of changes in the region in various cities and municipalities outside of the city of Columbus. Reynoldsburg has a new zoning code that does embrace density in companionship with mobility choices, especially at transit stop locations. So has Whitehall. They have some updated zoning. The city of Westerville, the one I'm in, has a zoning density bonus overlay for mixed-use projects around transit stops. And then various smaller ones are working on scalable. This will lead into our next question about scale, which we'll hold off. I know there's some momentum at the Buckeye Village area, Buckeye Lake area, regarding walkability, a mix of uses. It's a much lower scale, and it's a different feel, but it's still that idea of walkability and appropriate changes and how to get away from car-centric design. Who else would like to contribute to that conversation of Columbus's size? We're definitely growing. Feel free to tie it back to the census data we just got.
Well, I think the problem facing suburban, exurban, and rural communities is just like the problem facing a big city like Columbus, just at a smaller scale. We need to; these towns need to densify and make diverse city centers that are walkable, and that could be served by a regional transit network, connecting all these nodes into a network. And this can work because that's the way Ohio was 100 years ago. That's the way this part of the world was a century ago. All these towns, they had dense city centers. They were diverse uses, and they were connected by trains. This part of the world once had the highest rail network in density in the world. And also, people forget in the early 1900s, there was a revolution here in this part of the world, Ohio and Indiana, the electric interurban. And that was an electric railway that connected cities and small towns all around the region with trains that went like 55 miles an hour plus. If you ever get a chance to go to Groveport, there's a park called Blacklick Park, and there's an historic sign there talking about the old interurban railway that used to connect Groveport with Columbus. Every time I see that sign, I want to cry, because if we would give up so much, we would just love to have that back, because that's really what the way these cities grew up before the automobile. They were basically nodes connected in the network, and we could get back to that.
One question regarding growth and the census data. Thank you, Harvey, for that. We see the fastest growing groups of folks, which I think MORPC helped predict some time ago, is definitely the empty nesters or our retirees, as well as the younger workforce, the fastest growing demographic groups. How do you think that relates back to focusing on 15-minute neighborhoods and what that means to these particular demographic groups?
As someone with elderly grandparents, I think the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood is really critical to empty nesters and folks who are retirees. Having access to amenities that are more prevalent to folks in that age bracket are, I think, really critical to helping them to maintain a sense of independence for as long as possible. The idea of being able to have doctors in your neighborhood and pharmacy in your neighborhood, and more importantly, social connections that are relevant to you. I think that's really going to be critical to folks of a variety of age groups, particularly those who are older or retirees. As we talk about young people, I think people that are starting out, and we look at some of the housing that's being developed in the city as a whole, I worry about whether or not that housing is accessible based on the price point of most of the housing that's being developed. So if you're a young professional and you're in an entry-level position, what are the barriers to living in a 15-minute neighborhood based on housing price point? And the same can be true for the retiree population or the empty nesters, depending on their socioeconomic status. So I think that those are two key considerations.
I really I agree with Jordan 100%. And I'm probably the oldest person on this panel by a long shot. So I think about that that point in my life when maybe I'm not really going to feel comfortable driving. And it's going to be really important to me that that I feel like I can get around and do things and go to places I want to go. And then, because of where I'm at in life, my kids are young adults and we have lots of friends of theirs that we see. And, what Jordan's talking about in terms of the barriers to housing for just affordability for them is a very real thing. And the cost of transportation and having and owning a car and having to rely on that is, right now we have a family friend who's sort of facing, what happens if this car that she's got, it can't be repaired right now. And, these are all factors that influence how the life choices that these folks are making in ways that they really don't want it to. Their preference would be to make different choices for sure. And so, I think that just reinforces this sort of broader conversation.
Also, with respect to design, there's a concept called 880 cities, and there's an organization called 880cities.org. And the idea here is that when you design things, like when you design a 15-minute city, when you design infrastructure, you have to design it so that an 8-year-old and an 80-year-old and everyone in between can use it. So when you look at like a new bike lane or bike path, you got to look at it and say, well, would I let my 8-year-old or my 80-year-old parent use it? And if not, it's a failure. And the good news about designing for 880 is that if you design for that age range where an 8-year-old and 80-year-old could use it, you're also designing for people with different abilities, such as people who use walkers or wheelchairs. And you're basically designing very inclusively. So you capture 8-year-old, capture an 80-year-old in your design, you're capturing almost everybody in the city. And that's the way we should be thinking about our infrastructure investments right now.
So another question we received from the community at large, I'm going to reword it slightly. This is a car-centric culture. And to promote 15-minute cities, which we do have some really good examples, they include mobility choices, transit, biking, walking. What do you think are the focus? What should we be focusing on for that cultural shift of primarily car reliance, which spilled over into the design, to other mobility choices being an easier choice? What's the biggest thing we should focus on for that to happen? Cultural shift.
So something that I generally refer to is that policy begets culture. The Dutch don't have a bicycling culture. No one says, like, I ride my bike because my father and his grandfather rode their bike. No, they ride their bike because they have explicitly, through policy and design, made the bicycle the easiest way to get around. We effectively, unfortunately, it needs to be a policy that says, we need to start prioritizing different modes of transportation. We need to have different performance metrics. We need to have different funding formulas. And we also might need to start looking at how we fund things through the gas tax. We might need to start looking at the gas tax as a whole. And unfortunately, that does require action at the federal level, which is not politically palpable. But policy at the local level can have a huge impact on how we focus our efforts around transportation and mobility. What are our parking minimums? Do we need parking maximums? What are our density limits? And how do we currently measure success on our streets? Is it through level of service, speed, and flow, or is it through comfort, accessibility, and safety?
+1 to Austin. That's all I'm going to say. Well said. Perfect.
Excellent answer. Thank you. Okay, the next question. When will we expect, this is about urban agriculture, but I'm going to reword it as to our food system. So if you think about 15-minute cities, fresh food access is one of the elements of a 15-minute city, 15-minute neighborhood. What kind of policy shifts or changes do you see regarding a local food agriculture, a local food system to start contributing towards those 15-minute city elements?
I'll chime in a little bit because we've had some efforts around food access and public transportation here in Indy. Indy has some of the worst food deserts in the country. Our combination of historically disinvested transit system, falling incomes, and sprawl have made food access a very big problem for Indianapolis. We have recently been partnering with local employers, specifically a local employer known as Cook Medical Suppliers, who makes medical devices, and they are establishing a facility immediately adjacent to our Purple Line. And they're also partnering with a grocer to build a new grocery store at one of our bus rapid transit stations in one of our worst food deserts. Food access is one of those things where there is no easy answer. Sometimes it's a partnership with a private organization and working with a nonprofit. But for-profit grocery stores have very slim margins and are very difficult to sustain in low-income neighborhoods where they're probably not buying a whole lot of food at one time. And they can't buy a lot of the name brand things that churn out larger profits in more affluent suburban areas. And so that's kind of the one example that I can provide of a success story in Indianapolis so far. But I'm very interested to hear if anyone else has a different experience.
Well, here on the south side, this is more anecdotal and not so much policy related, but food insecurity and food access are certainly issues for many of the residents here on the south side as well. And what we have kind of observed is that the need, we're beginning to address that need through the fresh food market. We've established a fresh food market, which is the second highest distribution point by volume in Ohio, I believe. And so we are seeing upwards of 350 shoppers or families per day that market is open. We've also seen it draw people in need from other neighborhoods, such as the Linden community. And so that effort is actually being duplicated there to encourage this idea of having access to the things that you need within your community or within a short commute of where you live. So I would say that food insecurity and food deserts are issues here. I don't know what our policy strategy is necessarily to address them, given the points Austin raised. The margins on for-profit grocery stores are slim, and it's very hard to attract them when density is limited. But I think that we need to focus maybe on more urban scale retailers to kind of mitigate some of those overhead expenses and provide some points of access as we build out our commercial corridors.
So, yes, Harvey?
I shared a link in the chat. I don't know if you can share that more widely with the audience, but we just published a study at Cura in Ohio State that looked at the impacts of COVID on food access in Columbus. And we found that unequal access was exacerbated by COVID, where there was even more of a discrepancy between how the affluent shop for food versus the poor. The affluent were able to get food delivered and were able to, and these big name grocery stores were able to deal with online purchases and do it very smoothly. Meanwhile, the poor were still trapped in food deserts and having to still continue shopping at places like local stores and dollar store, general stores and things like that. So what already was a food crisis because of the way our system is laid out here in Central Ohio became worse during COVID. COVID was something that really shows some of the stresses and weaknesses in our system. And we have evidence by looking at people's shopping patterns. That's what that study looked at.
I'm going to shift. This is very good. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit because an important element to the 15-minute neighborhood, of course, is jobs. Housing choices, we've discussed, some food elements, access to transportation choices, but having jobs is really important. I can attest that a lot of folks utilizing CODA, even during the pandemic, they're going to work. They're wearing scrubs. They're wearing the Starbucks uniform. They're wearing their Kroger uniform. They are going to work. And so those transit options is really important for our workforce. And with the Link Us initiative, I really appreciate the partnership and the close collaboration with our municipal partners, especially with the city of Columbus, because what happens around these transit stops is going to be imperative to really working towards those 15-minute neighborhoods and then connecting the 15-minute neighborhoods together. So with that regarding job growth, job attraction, workforce development, we know we can't just build a line and it appears. What type of conversations do you feel need to happen at what levels to really understand how to attract the jobs, different types of jobs, to this idea of 15-minute neighborhoods, and what type of shift in thought process of scale and size do you think this might take? I'm going to start off with one example. We've had some great discussions with the Jobs Ohio at the state level regarding job attraction. And one change in conversation is instead of folks, you're interested in coming here, fantastic, love it. Instead of saying, how many cars do you need to park? We'd really like them to ask, how do you expect to get your workforce to work? And how can we help connect you to different mobility choices for that consideration? And ensure they understand that there is a system, a viable system, and that we would like to partner with them in understanding how to make that an easy choice. So that's like one example of a conversation at a level.
I think, that example is a good one because these things are interrelated and you can't, it's not just you do the one thing and then the other thing comes along. I think, right now we have a need to advance our transit system to provide confidence for employers and people who will invest in the creation of jobs that, they can attract and maintain a workforce. Obviously, the closer those jobs are to transit systems and stops, the better. I would go back to that comment I made earlier that we see opportunity in our corridors and some of our major retail centers that perhaps because of a changing retail world will not in future be what they have been in the past. And those are opportunities, we think, for investment in job creation. I know that when Central Ohio went through the process to compete for the Amazon headquarters, this is one of the questions that Amazon for HQ2 was asking in every community that they were considering. And whether you think that it was a good thing or a bad thing that Amazon did or didn't come here, I think one of the things that it pointed out was, it matters a lot to especially to bigger companies, how their employees are going to get around, how they're going to get places, and just recognizing that maybe relying exclusively on a suburban model of everybody drives a car isn't really helpful in the long term, isn't sustainable.
Thank you, Kevin. Jordan?
I was just going to add, I think another opportunity potentially, and not all neighborhoods have the benefit of having easy access to an anchor institution, but I think more and more large employers that are struggling to fill positions and who are experiencing longer commute times for the workforce, for the staff that they do have, are considering this idea of getting involved in the development of workforce housing and providing, in some cases, some of the gap financing to make those opportunities possible. Here on the South Side, we've created residences at Career Gateway, which is workforce housing, and it also includes a workforce development training space, which is providing pathways into jobs with Nationwide Children's Hospital, as well as some other South Side employers. And so I think leveraging relationships with anchor institutions who are in need of a workforce, who are interested in the idea of that workforce living in close proximity to the organization, I think that might be an opportunity to leverage some of those resources to finance those kinds of housing developments.
I look forward to, after this, finding out more about that. I think that sounds fascinating. I think that one thing we can brag about is Central Ohio does have job growth. Very, very good. And we're thankful for that job growth. We have population growth. So a lot of these ideas we're talking about, they're not new ideas. I think it's just an understanding how are these ideas applicable to, our community? Does it make sense? And how do we thoughtfully go about it together as a team? I really appreciate, Austin, your experience you're bringing from Indianapolis. I really highlighted some of the words you use. I think that'll be really helpful in some of our conversations we're going to have as we move along. We do look forward to visiting you again in the future when it's safe to really, there's a lot of lessons learned with some of our peer cities, and we appreciate you participating and helping us with these conversations here at our city. It's 12:15. We're going to take just a few minutes and see if there's any closing remarks from our panel regarding 15-minute cities. Should we say 15-minute neighborhoods or 15-minute cities? Columbus area is a little bit bigger than a 15-minute city generally. But we've talked a lot about connecting the neighborhoods and connecting the cities, which is wonderful. Well, let's take a few closing remarks. Any advice or thoughts generally for our community here in Central Ohio?
I'll start. First by saying I prefer 15-minute neighborhoods. Accessing everything within the city, especially in cities that are so similar and sprawly as Indianapolis and Columbus, is probably not super achievable. However, we can achieve accessing most things within 15 minutes. And if you can't access most things within 15 minutes, you should be able to access frequent public transportation within 15 minutes that can get you to the resources or education, healthcare, or just entertainment that you need and want. I think as a closing remark, I'm very excited to see these conversations ongoing. I'm excited to see cities like Indianapolis and Columbus that have historically not invested heavily in public transportation and their neighborhoods taking a more aggressive stance towards sustainability and making sure that the neighborhoods that we develop and redevelop are inclusive and restorative and can help people achieve a meaningful upward mobility, not only for themselves, but for future generations. So I know it's really, really hard fighting an uphill battle a lot of time in states like Indiana and Ohio that maybe are not super receptive at the state political level to things that we're doing. But I encourage everyone to remember that we're working not just for our current generations, but we're shaping cities that will exist 100, 200 years down the line.
I would echo Austin's comments, and I think one of the benefits of being in a profession for a long time is that you can see kind of the power of iterative change. When I started as a planner, these were all things that we were really interested in. But in some ways, planners were among the few people thinking about it. And there have been times, when the medical profession got involved to say, hey, walkability matters. It's important to our public health. And there's a degree to which, as a planner, you're like, well, we've been saying that, but we want to welcome more folks coming to the table, recognizing how really fundamental all these topics are and all these issues are. And so, we're at a point now where we're having a panel discussion about a 15-minute neighborhood or city, whichever you prefer. And I kind of with Austin, I like neighborhoods better. And we're able to talk about zoning code changes that we've either made or are contemplating that really reinforce the opportunities for mixed use development and, that can rely on a range of mobility options. So I really am encouraged by that. I think we've got a lot of work left to do, but I do think that we've made a lot of progress. And I would say too that, along the lines of this sort of iterative change, every community represented either on this panel or folks who are watching this conversation, engaging in it, can do smaller scale things that kind of move us forward. A lot of times it's a pedestrian connection to a multi-use trail that itself then connects you to a mix of uses or what have you. There are lots of things that we can be doing. It's a longer term thing, and I'm encouraged by what we're seeing.
And I'd like to jump in to follow up on Kevin's comments. I think what he's saying is really important about small things that we can do in order to move this along. We talked a bit about the linkage between transit and walkability, and that is really essential. That cannot be overemphasized, that we can't have good public transit without good walkability, because public transit picks up and drops off walkers for the most part. And we have to worry about not only these corridors, but we have to worry about the connectivity to these corridors. And, so I mentioned 880 cities about making our design more inclusive to more people. I also think something else we have to think about in the future is green space and tree canopy, because we're getting hotter. We already see that, and we're going to get hotter in the future. And we need to think about the green infrastructure as well as the gray infrastructure. We have to make walking a pleasant, enjoyable, healthy experience. And in the future where Columbus is hotter and also air quality may deteriorate because the two things are related, we'll need more tree canopy and more green space in order to mitigate that to a large degree. So I really encourage, and I'm a big fan of Linkus, as many people know. I think it's a really great approach. I think I really applaud MORPC. I applaud CODA and the City of Columbus for pursuing this. But I think as we build out this Linkus corridors, we need to be thinking about that part of it as well, about making the design access to it inclusive and healthy through 880 design principles and building out our tree canopy.
Excellent, thank you. Jordan, any last minute comments?
Just briefly, I have been very excited to participate on this panel. I think this is certainly a worthwhile topic, but I just wanted to bring us back to the idea of access facilitating equity. And to a degree, from my perspective, we know that the private market, in a lot of cases, is going to naturally provide access to 15-minute neighborhoods for those who are reasonably well resourced. So I think there just needs to be a degree of intentionality with regard to policy, with regard to planning, our conversations with the city and some of the development of public-private partnerships to ensure that that access is more equitably distributed for folks who are not at those upper income streams.
Excellent. And that is the perfect point to really underscore a lot of this discussion. And that's definitely an underscore of the Link Us initiatives and providing more equitable access to multiple opportunities. I don't think you could emphasize that enough. And I don't think that could, I think we need to continually ensure that's part of the conversation. And I appreciate that. With that, I want to thank the panel. Is there any other questions you have for me? I think we want to thank MORPC for hosting the Regional Housing Strategy Speaker Series. We continue to learn from each other and be inspired to continue for our community's future. So with that, I want to thank you, and I'm going to allow MORPC to sign us off. Have a great afternoon and a great Friday.